Hi, I'm the Pink Pastor. I post videos on Friday. Some of the content is about queer theology, some of the content is about being queer, and some of the content is the stories collected over 40 plus years of traveling and living in a greatly varied number of places. If you want midweek content, I publish on Instagram, @PinkPastor is the handle. I publish on Facebook, @PinkPastor365. If you need to get up with me, you can DM me on either one of those, or you can write me an email, pinkpastor365@gmail.com. And if you want to learn even more, go to my website, pinkpastor.com. Let me continue by saying thank you to Ellen for the microphone that is part of this filming and for the topic of this video. As she was talking to a queer person and they were discussing a comment I made in a previous video about it's only 1/3 the parent's fault, they were like, but I don't understand a little bit. And after a little bit of explanation, we decided that this was a good topic. And so today I'm going to talk about why it's only 1/3 your parent's responsibility, or if you are the parent, it's really only 1/3 your responsibility that your children ended up to be who they are. So here's the theory. Who we become as people is 1/3 the parenting, 1/3 the society we grow up in, and 1/3 just who we are. Now, I'm a queer person. I'm a lesbian. I'm transgender. These things come out of me. There's nothing my parents could have done. There's nothing the society could have done to have changed this. I'm not trans because my parents did something to make that happen. I'm not a lesbian because my parents did something to make that happen. I happen to find that women are the most attractive gender to me. I also happen to find that I'm not the same as my assigned gender at birth. I'm a woman with a transgender experience. It's okay. Now, what's interesting about this is I said it's 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. So 1/3 is me. 1/3 is how I was raised by my parents, and 1/3 is the society I grew up in. And some of that has to do with social location. You know, if I'm born in a rural area, that has different realities than if I'm born in a city. If I was born in the 70s, that has some different implications than the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s, which has different implications than the 40s. Those things are not necessarily good or bad, they're just different. And so where I grew up, the time, the place, and all that changes what happens with me as a person, who I become, if you will, as an adult. This, in part, talks about why it is that you can look at one kid who is just spot on, spectacular. Everything is perfect for this child. They do a wonderful job, and then you look at the parents and you go, how in the world did they ever come out okay? It's also why you can meet a parent who is incredible, does a fantastic job of parenting. You look at them and you say they do everything right, and yet their child leaves a little to be desired. We'll just go with that. In this sense, I've already talked about I'm the reason I'm queer, right? It's just an inherent part of who I am. As a transgender person, we would argue that, in fact, somehow a female brain ended up in what was then a male body. Once the doctors went, you're male, when I was born, and I went, you're wrong, when I was 48. My not coming out until I was 48. That's where the parental and societal pieces come in. So 1/3 parents, 1/3 society, somehow in all of that, more than 50% of it said, no, you're not going to live as a queer person. My parents were loving and caring. My parents didn't want me to get beaten up, quite honestly. And so they taught me to conform enough to societal expectations and norms of my assigned gender that I wouldn't get beaten up on the way home from school. I went to kindergarten and elementary school in the 70s, and there was no place in the mainstream culture for a transgender person. I'm not going to say there weren't trans people, because that was the era of Stonewall and other things, and so transgender as a thing was starting to come to take off, but it was still on the outskirts. In the late 70s, being gay or lesbian was relatively okay, but being trans was not even being represented. So together, those two, my parents trying to help me not be beaten up, and my society not having any representation of who I might actually have been, added up to more than 50%. 1/3 plus 1/3 equals 2/3. 2/3 is more than 50%. And so this is what then probably led me to burying that part of my reality. All of this is interesting because it doesn't relieve me as a parent from responsibility for my parenting of the child, because that is 1/3 of the equation. I need to do and be a good parent. But it does relieve me of the responsibility that when I do a fantastic job of parenting and things don't come out the way I want, that it fails to produce this wonderful, great child. This theory of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 does not relieve me as a parent from the responsibility for doing a good job of parenting my children. It is 1/3 of the equation, and that 1/3 added to any of the other two 1/3 can in fact be the piece that overcomes. And so if you have a great child and you're a great parent and you lived in a really bad society, you can in fact overcome that society. If you and the society do a great job, and maybe the child was on the edge, maybe it will make the difference. Maybe they will make the choices that help them to get there. So it doesn't relieve me as a parent from doing a good job of parenting. What it does relieve me as a parent from is when I've done a good job of parenting and I don't end up with a great child, I don't have to worry about that. That's not my problem. Well, it may be my problem. I take that back. It may well be my problem, but it's not my responsibility. It's not my poor parenting that led to this. It also means that to the extent that I, as a parent, control the environment that this child is raised up in, I need to. I need to understand that this environment is going to change who my child is, and so to the extent that I can change their environment, and I don't control all the environmental factors, but to the extent that I can control their environment, to that extent, I need to. Because that environment is then going to shape who they can be and what they become. But I also realize there is only so much I can shelter a child, and so in fact, the environment, to the extent that I control it, I do, but it's not entirely in my control. Now, it's interesting because in the middle of writing the script for this, I called my father. I was reminded of him in very sweet and warm ways, and so we discussed some of this, and we also discussed my own children, and talked about the fact that, you know what, my own children, he can see where some of what has happened with them, some of how they have come out, they blame it on parenting, and yet it's probably more just who they are. Sort of that confirmation that, you know what, part of it is just who they are. Part of it is, in fact, the worlds they grew up in, and part of it is me and my wife and how we parented them. So, me being queer, 100% is me. What I did with that being queer is partly about my parents and partly about the society. So, if you're a parent, take heart. It's not your fault that your child is queer. But I invite you to love and care for them with an open heart, because how you parent them may be the difference between whether they can accept that of themselves or not, and how quickly they come to accept themselves of that. Now, that said, if they're a nervous child and they're growing up in a place where it's not safe to be queer, no matter how much good parenting you do, they may still stay in the closet. But to the extent that they could come out early, you probably had something to do with that. It probably talked about them becoming comfortable with their own identity early on, and that is a very positive thing. So that's a little bit about my theory. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. In fact, 100% of who I am is my problem, but from a parenting standpoint, it's 1/3. Society is 1/3, and I am 1/3 of the influences that help to form those things in me. If you want more about societal forces and how they work, I invite you to check out my video on compulsive heterosexuality. I'll make sure that there is a link in the description to this video. If you want more on how I knew I was trans, I will put that link in the video as well. Again, I want to remind you that if you love this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps me. And if you like this sort of content, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. I can't cover everything here, so I invite you to come back as I get into this topic and other topics more in videos to come. Thank you. I'm the Pink Pastor, and I look forward to talking to you next time.